Although the truth is, we've seen this play last year in the USA. So if it could happen in America, why can't it happen in South Africa, right? But I think it actually plays into the theme, into the topic of today's discussion, which I want to talk with you a little bit about, which is a little bit about the purpose. We discussed yesterday, the Parsha this week, Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to the Jewish people before they come into the land of Israel. And of course, he's repeating to them, that's Deuteronomy, Eila HaDevarim, these are the words that he says to them. He admonishes them. He knows, our sages say, don't be too critical, especially if you've taken Dale Carnegie's course. It said, don't condemn, criticize, or complain, because you see what happens. The kids start running out if you be a little bit too critical. Is that why you're running out, my boy? But the critique, in one's old age, it's okay, it's acceptable for a parent, for a teacher, for a leader to want to tell their people what they believe can be corrected. Of course, even then we have to learn from Moshe Rabbeinu, because look at our Parsha, how Moshe does it with such sensitivity. You read the way he does it in with these references to the particular places where they've been. And so the Parsha continues, which we went through yesterday to some degree and will continue today, where he continues his words to the people. And he tells them what they have to know. He repeats the past. He goes on about the mistakes they made throughout the years, but it's not focused on that. He's focused on their future. You're about to go into the land of Israel. People complain that I talk for long sometimes, especially those of you who come to my shul. Rabbi, you go on too long. That's why we joke about our shul. We're not that frum per se compared to some of the other shuls in town. The only reason we really have a mechitza separating the men and women during services is because the rabbi's boring. He puts everybody to sleep. In fact, all insomniacs like to come to us because, I'm very good at that. If you open the videos here, you could see, how many people are sleeping already. Just kidding. So, those who are sleeping put the snowman on so you can't see them. I'm joking around. So, of course, we can't have people sleeping in shul. But if you think I spoke long, look at Moshe Rabbeinu here. What is it, 36, 37 days he's talking. He's talking on to the Jewish people. He's telling them his important messages that he feels that is his parting message for them. And among the things that he mentions, he's talking about how almost 40 years earlier, God had been ready to bring them to the land of Israel. We discussed yesterday, it would have been an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai into Israel. And finally, of course, unfortunately, that was delayed because of the various incidents that happened, most specifically the spies fiasco. And the Jewish people, we know the story where they insisted on sending the Meraglim, the spies, to scout out the promised land. And those spies, they came back with horror stories about the terrifying power of the land's inhabitants, which we discussed at great length a few weeks back. So you'll have to just look back at the videos, find which one it was. But what we discussed there, Winston says, sleeping makes us 1/60th closer to God. I see you paying attention, Winston. Very good. So what we said back then was the idea that, the spies, why they brought back that message. But that's all with commentary and explanation. If we just look at it from a very basic, pirush, pshat, from the very, very simple understanding of the verse, this was a lack of faith that they demonstrated. Their outright rejection of God's gift to them. And this, of course, God wasn't happy about this and caused us a 4-decade delay in the desert. And that whole generation died out. So the people that Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to now are the young generation. Even if they're already 60 years old, could they have been 60? Yes, they could have been 60 because it was a 40-year wait. And anybody who was above age 20 pretty much died out. So anyone who was 60 at this time was from the new generation, the young people who endured 40 years in the wilderness. And they're in the narrative as we go through our parsha, smack in the middle. Moshe interrupts himself and he begins recalling how, and remember this is on the advice of his father-in-law, of Yisro, how he appointed multiple judges in order to ease the burden of litigating, of judging the people. And so, of course, one wonders, yes, it's part of the history, but what's the connection? What does that have to do with their entering the land of Israel right now? And what does it have to do with us here today in South Africa and to all our participants from around the world? If you have been following the news and the media and seeing what's going on here, there's certainly a message and lesson for us here today. Why was it necessary, though, for him to interrupt what he was telling everybody and all of a sudden to say, to I guess, insert this seemingly unrelated historic episode? And Moshe goes on to tell them about their, all of a sudden, how his father-in-law, and if you want to read it along in the verse, let me just quickly find my place here. I am at the very beginning of our parsha. Verse 6 is where this narrative sort of begins, where he's telling them about everything. And all the way through, he continues telling them now about the incident where his father-in-law tells him to appoint judges. Okay? Now, of course, we wonder about this, but like I said, with most questions that I have, they're not necessarily my original questions. These are questions of the commentaries. These are questions that I share with you here that it seems to be out of place to be mentioning here the incident, not the incident, but this information of where Hashem tells him, where his father-in-law tells him to appoint the judges. Okay, so there's a few commentaries here that I want to look at and discuss with you and dissect and analyze, and of course, take lessons from. Just a second, it seems like our connection is a little bit unstable. Can everyone see? Is everything all right? Okay, I hope it's okay for you all. My computer, everything just shut for a second. If you're able to see, good. So the Kli Yakar is a very famous Spanish sage, from the Middle Ages, and he oftentimes picks up on very interesting aspects of the parsha. And he says as follows: takes this verse where Moshe says, and I said to you at the time, saying Moshe is repeating to the Jews what happened. So the Kli Yakar says, what's at the time? He says, this is referring to the time when Moshe told the Jewish people to come and inherit the land. They were on the way then, 40 years ago, meaning now it's 3,330 years ago. But when they were in the desert, before the incident of the spies, before their delays, Moshe said to them, come, we're ready to enter the promised land. And at that point, the appointment of judges, he says, was relevant. It was a timely matter. It was important. Because if you're going to dwell in the land, a land has to have law and order. We know the Torah itself tells us, tzedek, tzedek, tirdaf. Justice, justice shall you pursue them. And tichya v'yarash tetzaretz. God's words, pursue justice in order that you should live and possess the land. So the Kli Yakar is telling us here that if you look in the Torah itself, the Torah is telling us you want to appoint, the reason why Moshe is appointing the judges is so you can enter the land. And we know that the importance, and our sages tell us in Pirkei Avos, to pray for the welfare of the government, even if it's a wicked government. Why pray for because if you don't have a functioning government, then each person swallows the other alive. That's just the way it is. It's anarchy. And it's sort of what we're seeing at the moment, unless the government, in fact, does take a stand and does take action. So we need justice, and I think it's a very relevant topic that we see it in our portion this week, this whole discussion just to sum it up, to bring us all into what we're just saying, that according to the Kli Yakar, he says there's no intrinsic connection between entering the land of Israel and the appointment of judges. He's telling us that any place you want to be sane, any place you want to live, even in the desert, it was necessary to have a functioning judiciary system. So all the more so, if you're going to enter the land, then for sure you have to make sure we have a judicial system in place. Okay, so with that being the case, let us just quickly recap our discussion. So we said here Moshe is talking to the Jewish people about their history, and we asked this question: what's the connection of the judicial system that he's mentioning right here, just as they're entering the land? And we spoke here, of course, it's relevant at the moment because they're about to enter the land, but all the more so wherever they are, these laws are relevant and are necessary. And so that's the basic connection. But let's take it a step further. Let's dig a little bit deeper. The Torah, as we know, is multifaceted. It can be understood on many, many levels. In fact, they say Shivim Panim La Torah. We mentioned yesterday the 70 languages in which the Torah was translated. And the commentaries tell us in the Talmud there are 70 dimensions, 70 perspectives. And I think the number 70 is not arbitrary. It's a number that's relevant to, perhaps because there were 70 nations of the world and 70 languages at the time. But the point is saying is every country, every perspective, look right here between us, we all have different ways of understanding. We talk about Israel just had a new president and a new government. A couple of years back, I don't know which prime minister it was, whether it was Begin or maybe it was Golda Meir, and he was talking with Carter at the time. So Carter was showing off, says, I'm the president of the United States of America. We have 250 million citizens in this country. You're just a prime minister of a small little country in the Middle East. How many citizens you got there? Just 5 million. So Begin says to Carter, you're right, you're the president of 250 million citizens, but I am the prime minister of 5 million prime ministers. And I think that little anecdote can be understood in many different ways. You ever go to Israel? I've been to Israel many times, thank God. Every taxi driver knows how to run the country better than the prime minister. If I were the prime minister, they always tell you, I would do it differently. I would do it like this. Maybe here too. I don't know. I haven't engaged enough with everyone to know. Here too, of course, it's a thing around the world. Everybody knows better than the people in the position of leadership. So the fact that the idea that sages are telling us different faces of the Torah, there's so many different ways of understanding it. Now, of course, we have to understand that according to the Torah, we can't twist the Torah to fit our own narratives, our own interpretation. But knowing that there are so many interpretations of the Torah, someone's saying that the sound is a bit unstable. If your sound is unstable, I don't know what to say. I apologize. Someone could sponsor a new good sound equipment here. Maybe it will be better. In the meantime, I hope it's okay for everyone. If it isn't, I apologize. So the idea that the Torah is understood, hold it stable in Indonesia. Just a second, guys. Take some papers. Thank you for that. So we just have to check what's going on in Joburg. Sometimes it's more stable on the other end of the world than it is next door. All right, that's just the way it goes. Maybe this is part of the different dimensions of Torah. But when it's more stable, when it's less stable, one perceives it this way, one perceives it that way. So if we look at this story, obviously we understand the importance of appointing judges, especially as they're about to enter the land of Israel. But let's just go a little bit deeper and try to understand it and maybe appreciate its relevance and its message based on the teachings of Hasidus. I want to share with you a fascinating idea that's taught in Hasidus about the concept of the conquest of the land of Israel. We know that the land of Israel was the greater Israel, biblical Israel, at the time was occupied by 7 nations. Now, of course, that's in a literal sense. But if you want to understand it in a more spiritual sense, what does the number 7 nations represent? So the 7 nations that occupied the land of Israel at the time is symbolic of the 7 negative traits that we have to conquer within ourselves, which we discussed this concept a few weeks back when we were talking about the story of the spies. And the idea, of course, is every concept of Torah. Yes, the Torah is telling us a literal story about conquering the land of Israel, the geographic location of the Middle East, as you could see in this diagram. But on a more spiritual level, making it relevant to each one of us, we are like the land of Israel. And there are 2 kings who want to conquer the land. Who's going to conquer it? Is it going to be Israel? Is it going to be Hamas, right? They have this type of analogy. Now, we're saying that within the land, at the time, there were 7 nations who inhabited, who lived in the land. And so we have to be able to conquer those 7 nations, as the Torah tells us. But within ourselves, what we have to conquer is our own 7 negative character traits, which we will discuss. Let me quickly read to you this concept as it's taught in the teachings of the Mittler Rebbe, the 2nd Rebbe of Chabad, Rabbi Dov Ber, who was the son and successor of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, the author of the Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch. And he says as follows. The verse in our parsha tells us that God says, I descended there to rescue them from the land of Egypt, and Hashem brought us to a good, spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of listing, the Torah tells us, the 7 nations, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And says the Mittler Rebbe as follows. It is known that the reason God gave the land of Israel specifically to the Jewish people. There's lots of countries around the world, every nation has their place. The land of Israel God gave to the Jewish people. As is written, I've given them this land as an inheritance. In fact, the Rebbe many times emphasized this idea when we stand before the nations of the world talking about why the land of Israel is the Jewish homeland. Some people will refer to the Holocaust after all the terrible things that happened to us. Some people will refer to the Balfour Declaration, and will refer to Theodor Herzl, and will refer to the UN partition plan, and to all the other wonderful references of legal claims to the land. But the most legal claim is this very verse. God says, I gave this land as a gift to the Jewish people. That's it. You don't need any other reference. For all the people in the world who believe in the Bible, here you go. So this idea that God gave us the land, on the literal sense, we're talking about God giving us the land of Israel. But in a figurative, more spiritual sense, we're talking about that 7 nations that occupy the land. These are the 7 negative character traits of the evil within ourselves, of the Yetzer Hara, of the evil inclination, that every person has, and that we have to work on refining. So how do you refine it? How do you refine our emotions, our instincts? Now, I know I'm talking to an illustrious holy crowd, but I also see myself right here. That's the problem with Zoom, is I get to see myself. It looks like I'm talking to me, even though I see lots of other wonderful people here on the screen. Right? I see Monty, I see Lester, I see Cynthia, I see Abigail, Ashley, Benzi, and Darren, and Derek, and Gail, and Simone, and Helen, and then a whole lot of people that I don't know their names, and Leo, and Lucette, and Matty, and Mervyn, and Mickey, and Monty, and Odette, and Sheila, and Vivian, and Winston, and I can't tell who all the other people are because not everybody has a name. But the point I'm making is, I'm just going to talk to myself, and if the hat fits, you can wear it too. I know for myself that there are areas and aspects of my life I could improve. Okay, I'm a human being. All human beings hopefully know, unless you're a tzaddik. A tzaddik is literally perfect. So how do we work on refining them? So it's basic. Jewish thought tells us, and Chassidus is emphasizing this, that we have to study more Torah and perform more mitzvahs. When we do so, we're automatically working on refining ourselves. Now, think about that. only when the Jewish people came to the land of Israel were they actually obligated in the performance of the Torah and the actual mitzvahs. They weren't, before arriving there, they didn't actually have to do most of the mitzvahs. They weren't relevant. So, for example, the Mishnah talks about Zrayim. Only in the land of Israel did they have the laws of agriculture, or Kachim, temple law. Until they came to the land of Israel, it's true they had the tabernacle in the desert, but most of the laws became effective only in the land of Israel. And Taharas, the laws of ritual and purity. Again, that also hinged on their living in the land of Israel. So the majority of the mitzvahs that are mentioned are relevant, are manifest, are effective, are what's the word I'm looking for? Are applicable only in the land of Israel. So by performing these mitzvahs in Israel, what they were able to do was to refine these 7 negative character traits that were represented by these 7 nations that previously, formerly inhabited the land. Now, for ourselves, we have to understand, if we want to build on the idea that entering the land is our spiritual journey, which everything in Torah has to be seen that way. Yes, there's the literal story. That's his story. Yeah, it's a story long ago. But there's also our story in it. So then we could apply the idea. So now we want to look at our parsha. We're learning about Moshe Rabbeinu talking about appointing the judges. And he's telling it to them at this point in their journey, just as they're about to enter the land, while he's repeating all the other things. Now, of course, you could just say, well, he's just repeating everything that happened. But why is that a relevant point of information? If you're looking at everything that he's telling them, he's not just rehashing history. He's telling them the information that's important. So the need for the judges are not just about adjudicating financial litigations, dealing with theft, dealing with looting and other craziness going on. But I'm talking about the internal judges. Each person, we have to honestly judge ourselves. Let's not judge all the other people out there. There are people in place who need to do that. But what about judging ourselves? It's so easy to judge everybody else. How about judging myself first? Can I judge my own actions? Can I see if I am doing what's right in this world? Am I advancing my spiritual purpose, my own mandate to be a light in this world? Or am I doing the opposite? Only I can honestly answer that question for myself. And of course, each person for themselves. So this is the idea that we have to, I think, work on within ourselves. And therefore, just as the Torah and mitzvahs only became effectively relevant in the land of Israel, to ourselves as well, if we want to refine ourselves to be a land of Israel, to be the right place, to be holy as we ought to be, then we have to work on ourselves as well. Now, the thing is, I know it's not always so easy. Not always easy to do that, right? It's much easier for me to judge other people. It's much easier for me to look at everybody else and find everyone else's faults than to find my own. That's why I have kids, thank God. The kids know how to tell me. Now, some people tell me that's why they get married. The spouse could tell it to them. In my case, thank God my wife, she doesn't tell me my problems. But the kids make sure I know. So what can we do? Right? We all have our rights. We all have our wrongs. We all have our problems. We all know we have that little enemy, hidden enemy within ourselves, deep inside, and we have to work on refining ourselves. We have to work on improving. Everyone has their specific areas in life that they can work on. So I can't answer that question. So the question asks us, how many mitzvahs can we do now? I don't remember the number offhand. It could be 93. I think it's a little bit more than that. But just a second, ladies and gents.
She said I can.
All right. So the actual number, I once had it in front of me. It's much less. It's maybe 100 and something. I don't know the exact number. Maybe it is 93. I don't know offhand. But the point is that, yes, there's a lot less. But don't forget that there's principal mitzvahs, and then there are subcategories, and then there are rabbinic enactments, and there are customs. And we have to know the difference between a custom, even though a custom, we say, minhag Yisrael Torah. There's an expression that the customs of the Jewish people are like Torah. Somebody once said to me, the minhag, it depends. If it's your minhag or my minhag. If it's my minhag, Torah, it's holy, it's pure. If it's your minhag, minhag has the same letters as the word Gehenna, right? If you ever play with gematria, and well, it's not even gematria here. You just rearrange the letters, a quick Scrabble game. Minhag Gehenna. If it's your minhag, it's Gehenna, right? Where people like to debate what's a good minhag, what's not. But the point is, yes, we should ideally be working on ourselves and refining ourselves and becoming better and all that, which is important. But it doesn't always turn out that way. And that's because within each person, we all have our struggles, our challenges. And not only that, there's a concept that if any of you read Hayom Yom, which we read at Shul every day, it's just a quick, short thought for the day. And in there's one entry, I don't remember the exact date, but it was fairly recent, because I know we were in Shul and we read this, the concept of a Hasidic Yetzer Hara, a pious evil inclination. What's a pious evil inclination? The pious evil inclination is sort of the one that disrupts us from doing. Just a second. Okay, mommy said no, then it's no. So the pious evil inclination is the one that sort of gets in the way when we know we're supposed to pray and says, now's the time to study. When we should be doing a good deed or helping somebody out, gets in the way and says, no, not now. You know what I'm talking about? You ever had a pious evil inclination? It's a concept. If you don't relate to it, you're very holy. But the point is that it's a very pious evil inclination. It tells us why not to give charity to a poor person. Because that person, how do you know what they're going to do with the money? Maybe they're going to use it for drug. Okay, the truth is that there is logic to that, so I'm not giving the right example. But the point is, the pious evil inclination is the one that sort of makes it's that sinister force within us, within our psyche, that's persuading us to do bad things on a pretense that it's pious, that it's good. The thing is, we're accustomed to thinking of this as, what do people think of the devil, right? With horns on its head and a pitchfork in its hand, telling us to do the most terrible things in the world. But we all know our own inner demons. And whenever we spot them, we should know how to, we're quick to suppress, to vanquish them. Because the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, as we call it, is not always, he's clever. Not always does he come looking like that devil with the horns on its head and a pitchfork in its hand. The evil inclination could come in very pious and clever ways and tell us why there's something more important to do than what we should be doing. So the thing is that in this insight, what Chassidus is telling us is that the Yetzer Hara could be far more benign, could assume a much more virtuous, a pious presentation. Doesn't present itself as the devil. This evil inclination, the Yetzer, is a convincing, cunning force. All sorts of tactics and tricks to convince us to do the wrong thing. Just a second. Please. No, Michal, I'm teaching now, okay? So you have to just be quiet. Okay, is this good? So sometimes it's going to hedge its bets, right? It knows not even to attempt us, not even to convince us to do something that we know is outright wrong, because after all, we're clever, smart, good people. We know what's right and wrong. So it starts off with what appears to be noble. Right? It starts off with pious-looking attempts. And later on, it will get us further down the road to do worse things. I think I'm getting strange looks from people. I think this is something nobody here relates to. So I'll have to, it's something that I relate to. You know, I'll give you a very benign example, but if when I'm supposed to be praying and I have the temptation to study, that's the Hasidic Yetzer Hara. That's this pious evil inclination. Okay, and this idea that the Yetzer Hara doesn't immediately reach for evil is something that Talmud, in fact, talks about. Let me share it with you in the words of the Gemara. Okay, so this is a Masechet Shabbos, Tractate Shabbos, Daf Kuf Hey Amud Beis, page 105b. Says the Gemara, if a person rends his garments in the chamasa in anger, okay? A person breaks his vessel in anger. You ever get into a situation that, oh goodness, there's so much going on. You ever get into a situation where a person gets so angry and they just break things, right? They need a punching bag instead. Hopefully the kids don't become the punching bag. Person scatters the money in anger. The Gemara is giving different examples of this. And says the Gemara, a person who behaves this way in anger is regarded as a idol worshiper. Ka'ovid avodah zara. It's like a person worshipped idols. Why? So the Talmud explains, Shekach umnasir shel Yetzer Hara, because this is the craft, the craftiness, the wiles of the Yetzer Hara. What does the Yetzer Hara do? Hayom amar lo yaseh kach. Today the Yetzer Hara says, do this, something benign, something simple. Ulamachar amar lo yaseh kach. And tomorrow he tells the person, do something else. Until it reaches a stage that the person literally worships idols and betrays God and acts in the most terrible ways. So the Talmud is making it clear. I mean, there's another point the Talmud makes elsewhere, that if a person gets angry, then it's a lack of faith in God. We see what goes on. We realize God's in control of the world. We shouldn't get angry. Anger is a lack of faith in Hashem. But in another sense, the Talmud is saying here, very simply, consequentially, that what happens today, the Yetzer Hara doesn't tell a Jew right away to eat shrimp and ham and lobster and whatever chazarai. It says today, just do one little thing. And then the next day, just something else, until it gets completely out of hand. That's the Yetzer Hara's tactic. So it starts off with a sin on a minor scale, and the person concedes, capitulates, does whatever that might be. And as the Talmud was saying, eventually, all the way down the line, we don't even realize how that happens. It causes the wanton destruction. The example in the Talmud is just Baal Tashchis, was being destructive, destroying things. And yet the Gemara says that is idol worship, because it was done out of anger. Because if we follow the Yetzer Hara's advice, then it convinces us to follow, to commit whatever terrible things that it, in its evil clutches. All the way down to idolatry, as the Talmud put it. Share with you another interesting point the Gemara makes here. This is in Masechet Sukkah, Tractate Sukkah. This is Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis. This is on page 52b. Says the Gemara that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he's a very great sage, very interesting Talmudic sage and scholar. He was friends with one of the Roman governors at the time. Told the story another time. He says as follows: the Yetzer Hara has 7 names. Hashem called it evil, as it says, and he quotes a verse for each one of his points. Ki Yetzer Lev Adam Ra min ha'ara. It's a verse at the very beginning of Bereshis that says the evil inclination of our heart is the evil of the heart from one's youth. Very beginning of the Torah. And then it tells us Moshe called it oral, a foreskin. As it says, there's a verse that says, Umaltem as arlas levavchem. We're going to read this verse in the Torah now. That circumcise the foreskin of your heart. What do you mean the foreskin of your heart? So Chassidus elaborates and discusses this idea, the concept that where we concede to our instincts, where we don't do things proper, we don't have the mind controlling our. Okay, I don't want to get too stuck in the Gemara here, but the Gemara basically goes on about the evil inclination, just telling us how bad it is. I'm not going to read all the points of the Talmud, but the last one I do want to mention to you. The last name. It goes through each of the different names here, which we don't have time for right now. But the last name the Gemara says is Joel. Joel is the very famous prophet. Well, there's a book of the prophets called Joel, which is a story about a person who was very wealthy and many kids and had all these terrible calamities in his life. He called the Yetzer Hara Tzifuni. What does Tzifuni mean? Tzafun, like at the end of the Seder. Tzafun Berach. Tzafun means hidden. And he quotes a verse. The pasuk says, Zois hatzfuni archaki me'alechem, which means, but I will remove far off from you the hidden one. So our sages explain, Gemara goes on to expound on this. The verse means, I'll distance from you the northern one, Tzafuni. This refers to the evil inclination, which is constantly hidden in the heart of man. So we have that hidden enemy, which is our evil inclination. And as we've been discussing, what we need is to have our own internal judges. So what is the internal judge within ourselves? How are we going to deal with our own struggles and challenges if the evil inclination is this hidden enemy within the heart of each person? So if we think about this, the idea that the Yetzer Hara has its various ways, tactics of dealing with us. And I think this name is probably the most telling of them all, of the 7 names that the Talmud lists, because it's showing us how it's hidden, tzafun. It camouflages itself to try to get us to do things that are wrong, and sometimes even cloaking itself in garbs of piety. So what is the Talmud telling us? That look to what degree we have this evil inclination with ourselves that tries to convince us to commit things that we shouldn't be doing. So the first thing the Talmud said was it tries to get us to do something trivial, a minor sin. Here the person, we're aware of the sin we're about to commit, but perhaps we overlook it, right? We have some excuse, some reason, some justification. But once we cross that line, that's when things keep getting out of hand, rolling downhill, until, God forbid, a person comes to willfully commit serious transgressions, violations of the Torah, which previously we would never even consider. But the second path that we mentioned here, which the Talmud in Shabbos says, is that's even more devious, because the Yetzer Hara is convincing the person that there's really no sin at all. That it's pretending to be virtuous, right? A person, just relax, take it easy. You need a good break. What do we need a break? And as soon as it cools us off from our spiritual devotion, once we feel like we no longer need that passion, the enthusiasm, the excitement, that's a tactic of the Yetzer. Relax, don't be so passionate in your service of Hashem. So, of course, as the Talmud mentions, there are various tactics that it has. But the point that we have to remember is that we have to summon up our inner strength. We have to resolve. We have to take our absolute inner power to reject the Yetzer Hara's overtures. But when the Yetzer Hara is playing sly, we sometimes don't even recognize what we're up against. It's not just little by little that it's getting us, but it's pretending to be pious. It's pretending to be, it's telling us that during a time we should be doing one thing to do something else. And in fact, the Talmud gives an example for this. The Talmud says there are dogs in Rome that know how to be effectively persuasive. The dog goes and sits by the store and appears as if he's sleeping. The owner of the store, who's now complacent, also sleeps. And the dog then grabs a loaf of bread, and before the owner realizes what's happening, the dog runs off with the bread. That's the Talmud's example. And what's the Talmud trying to tell us? The same thing, the same ploy of the Yetzer Hara. First, the Yetzer Hara appears to be, just disguised, they're pious. But then, once we drop our guard, the Yetzer Hara knows to grab that loaf of bread, to drag us to where we sadly shouldn't go. Of course, this is the idea, they called this the fruma Yetzer Hara, the pious evil inclination. Okay, so this is something that's addressed many, many times in Hasidic thought, how to deal with it, what we should do, how we should apply, what we could do to overcome it. And that's what I want to just dedicate the remaining time of our discussion, because we said, when did Moshe tell the Jewish people to appoint the judges? When does he remind us that to them? Just before they're about to enter the land of Israel. So if you want to apply that concept, before we attempt to refine our 7 negative character traits representing the 7 nations that occupied the land at the time, then we have to judge, we have to evaluate ourselves, we have to ask ourselves. Now, Zeb, I see you're here. A few weeks back, we were learning a mimer together. No, Zeb disappeared. We were learning a mimer, a Hasidic discourse. And in this mimer, we talked about the garments of the soul. What are the garments of the soul? Machshava, dibur, ma'aser, thought, speech, action. Thought, speech, and action are the garments of the soul. And just a second. The thought, speech, and action are the garments of the soul, and therefore they have to be in the right place. Our own thought, speech, and action. Meaning, do I analyze my behavior? Is it in the right place? My kids were asking me the other day, I was preparing a eulogy that I was to give at a funeral, and I was talking about this person was always positive. So my 7-year-old daughter asks me, Sarah Rosa says, this person always had COVID? And the perspective of how positive is seen these days. So it's a question we have to ask ourselves. Everything I do is my desire to eat food coming from a place of let's focus on the positive first, to want to refine that food and use its energy to do good in the world? Or is the purpose of eating that food just to behave beastly, to give in to my coarser, my just desire for good food, right? You got to ask ourselves these questions. Is it coming from my 7 spiritual qualities, or from the evil inclination, or from the good inclination? And that's the job of a judge. A judge has to be as objective as possible and to cross-examine the witnesses, right, to determine the truth of the various claims that comes before the judge. And this is what we have to constantly do. We have to do the same thing with our own evil inclination. We have to know, is it a clear-cut evil inclination, a Yetzer Hara, or is it pretending to be pious? We can't have that complacency that we described before. And of course, we have to know when that setup is happening. So let me just fast forward here. So this was what we talked about, the metaphor of the dog. Here we go. Here is the important message that I think we have to apply in our own lives. We have to be able to ask ourselves in every situation whether whatever I'm doing, is it right? Is it wrong? We have to be the judges of ourselves. There's a verse in Isaiah. We're going to read the prophecy of Isaiah we read during this time of the year. We're going to read Lamentations on Saturday night. On Sunday, if God forbid Mashiach is not here by then, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. And there's a verse in From the prophet Isaiah, he says, L'ruach mishpat layoshev ala mishpat. For the spirit of justice to the person who sits, or to the one who sits in judgment. V'ligvura mishive milchama shara. And for might, for those who bring back the war to the gate. So the Gemara explains, what does this mean, the spirit of justice? It says, what's the spirit of justice? This is the one who controls their own Yetzer Hara. We say this in Pirkei Avos, very famous Mishnah, that says, Ezeu Gibar, who's truly strong? HaKoiveshes Yitzray, the one who knows how to conquer their evil inclination. What does it mean, the one who sits in judgment? Says the Talmud, that's a person who is a judge over himself. Forget about judging everybody else. And for might, again, it's saying the one who overcomes the Yetzer Hara. So Rashi explains on this that the person who judges his spirit, the one who rules the Yetzer Hara, he rejects his Yetzer Hara. He knows to do teshuvah of his past wrongdoings. And the person who overcomes the Yetzer Hara, Rashi in that tractate of Sanhedrin, the Talmud says, what does this refer to? A person who rallies his Yetzer Hara against his Yetzer Hara. When the Yetzer Hara tells him to do a sin, not only does he not commit the sin, but he does a mitzvah and says, hey, you think you're going to get me to do something wrong? I'll show you. I'll do the opposite. It's overcoming it in a much stronger way. So the Sachachaver, very famous Hasidic rabbi, he has a very interesting twist and interpretation of this Talmudic discussion. He says, what does it mean who sits in judgment? Right? What is the implication of sitting in judgment? This is where you start analyzing the words. The beginning and the end of the verse speaks of someone who's battling with the Yetzer Hara. And the middle talks about the person who is in judgment of it. How do you judge it? So he says a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful idea coming from the Sachachaver in our Parsha, as Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jewish people as they're about to enter the land of Israel. And he says as follows. The Gemara says one who issues a true ruling in between this idea of the verse of Isaiah, explaining that there's a person who's in control of, who judges his Yetzer Hara and overcomes the Yetzer Hara. So says the Sachachaver Rabbi, he says one who issues a true ruling refers to one who issues a true ruling with regards to the Yetzer Hara, doesn't allow himself to be blinded and to confuse good for bad, as this pious Yetzer Hara here sometimes appears. But he understands and he judges his every single action to determine where is it coming from? Where is it going to lead me to? What I'm doing right now, is it going to be the right thing? Is it helping humanity? Is it helping my purpose, my function, my mission, the reason why I'm here in this world? So he says there's three levels in this verse from Isaiah about the Yetzer Hara itself. First, he talks about the spirit of justice. So this refers to a person who rules his Yetzer Hara in the sense that he rejects it. He repents from sin which is known to him. If he's done something wrong, he says, that's not my behavior. I don't do that. He says that's the first kind of way of dealing with the Yetzer Hara. The second level is to honestly assess oneself, to judge myself, so that I should not be convinced by the Yetzer Hara tells me, and to know when to eliminate it. Okay, now sometimes that's a little bit harder to do because you really have to know the Yetzer Hara's tactics. The third level, he says, is the person who overcomes the Yetzer Hara completely. Obviously, that's more like a tzaddik, but this is, it says the Yetzer Hara tells him to sin. Not only doesn't he commit the sin, but he overcomes it. He does a mitzvah instead. This is an even higher level of service. He says this is like outstanding when a person reaches that level. It's in Hasidic parlance called ishapcha. There's one concept called iskafia. Iskafia is resistance. Resistance is that I'm not going to listen to the Yetzer Hara, right? I'm resisting it. But ishapcha is transforming it, taking the darkness and making it light, taking the bitter, making it sweet. That's a whole new level. And that's what we have to ideally aim to get to. That's the level We have to really try to get to where we don't give up, but on the contrary, we fight off the Yetzer Hara. That's something that takes a lot more work. So the idea of appointing the judges then is, how am I judging myself? This Yetzer Hara is hidden. It's a hidden enemy within myself. How am I going to identify it? And to know what is coming from the right place and what's coming from the wrong place. Now, of course, we know that it's not always easy to deal with all these situations, okay? So we have to find a way to do it. Says King Solomon in Mishle, Ki ner mitzvah, you're looking for the candle. You're looking for the light in life. That's the mitzvah. The Torah ner mitzvah, the mitzvah is the candle. The Torah and how do you ignite the candle? That's the mitzvah, that's the Torah. Okay? Again, ner mitzvah. Mitzvah is a candle in your life, and Torah is the light of that candle. V'derech chayim teichachos mosor. And disciplining rebukes are the way of life. Moshe Rabbeinu is telling the people in our parsha to learn from the mistakes. When we can learn from our past, from our mistakes, then we can fix them in the future. You've heard the famous Talmudic statement that says, Yedias machle chatzi refuah. Being aware of a disease is already half the cure. If a person doesn't acknowledge that they have a disease, how could they ever seek cure from the illness? So this is how we take, that's Devarim, that's our parsha, that's this whole book. It's reviewing the Torah, it's taking the lessons from it. That's what Moshe is telling the people to do. And what King Solomon's telling us is if we light our candle, we light up our path, then we can dispel the doubts, we could eliminate the challenges and struggles that come our way. Sometimes you ever lost, especially if it's in the dark, go out on a camping trip and you don't know where you're going. It's so difficult to find the way. So the message here is that we have to find the way. We have to do what we can. And of course, God provides us the ability to do so with the Torah, with the study of Torah, with the mitzvahs. When the light is on, it's always easy to find your way, right? And that's the idea why the Torah is the antidote to the evil inclination. Because if we deal with our internal judges and we're able to rule over our Yetzer Hara, not just that, but sit in judgment, which we discussed the various levels. But the ideal is to transform it. So can we transform our 7 attributes, which we discussed before? Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchus. It's quite complicated to go through all the 7. I'm not going to do that in today's shir, but each one of us to know how to deal with each of these attributes in a way that we spiritually refine ourselves and uplift ourselves. Let me just look here. I want to share with you one more point from the Gemara. Okay, one more little insight from the Talmud today. Says the Gemara, this is Masechet Kedushin, Daf Laman Abed Beis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Omer Lem Yisrael, God, the Holy One, says to the Jewish people, Bane, my children, I created the evil desire, but I also created the Torah as its antidote. If you occupy yourselves in Torah, you will not be delivered into the hand of the evil inclination. For it says, if you dwell, shall you not be exalted? But if you do not occupy yourselves with the Torah, you should be delivered into the evil inclination. As it's written, sin crouches at the door. And the Gemara goes on to say, it was taught, Tana Devei Rabbi Yishmael, was taught by the school of Rabbi Yishmael. If this repulsive wretch assails you, lead him to the yeshiva, to the place of study. If he is of stone, he will dissolve. If iron, he will shiver into fragments. For it says, is not my word like as fire, says Hashem, and like a hammer that breaks the rock into pieces. If he's of stone, he will dissolve, for it's written, Hoi, everyone, whoever's thirsty, let them come to water. What's water? Water is a reference to Torah. So the basic concept, the basic idea is Remember that the Yetzer Hara could obviously pretend to be pious. And remember that when we are ever ensnared, whenever we're confronted with these conflicting thoughts, no matter how noble they might be, if you detect that it's at the wrong time, at the wrong place, it might be the pious Yetzer Hara. And remember that the best way to fight such a sinister enemy is not to engage it, but rather to increase in Torah. And when we're trying to enter, when one is trying to enter your own land, to rid ourselves of the negative character traits of the 7 nations that occupy it, then don't rely on superficial self-examination, but rather we need to have the judges. We need to swim deep into the sea of Torah. And from there, we'll receive that spiritual fortitude, the ability to vanquish our Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination, and to dwell peacefully in the land of Israel. Please God, each one of us will have that experience in the best way possible, overcome our struggles and our challenges, and please God, we'll all be in the right place to do the right things at the right times. Any questions before we go? Okay, with that, my dear friends, I'm going to wish you all a wonderful day. Please God, we'll see you tomorrow. And tomorrow, please God, we will delve more into topics relating to the period we find ourselves in, the 9 days, the preparation for Tisha B'Av, and concepts connected to that. I'm looking forward to see you tomorrow and to discuss those ideas. Sei gesund, looking forward.